All right, today we're going to tackle a topic that affects pretty much everyone in the workplace. What happens when an indefinite employment contract, or a CDI, comes to an end? Now, that word indefinite sounds pretty permanent, right? But surprise, it's not. So let's break down exactly how this all works. So, that big question, does indefinite actually mean forever? Well, the short answer is nope, not at all. See, unlike a fixed-term contract that has a specific end date baked right in, a CDI just keeps on going until someone, either you or your employer, officially says, okay, we're done. It doesn't just run out of time on its own. Right, so how does one of these things actually end? It's not like it just fizzles out. One person has to formally give the other a termination notice. And the moment that happens, it officially kicks off something called the notice period, or délai de congé. That's when the clock really starts ticking. And here's something that's really important about this whole process: the idea of equality. The law is super clear on this. The notice period has to be the exact same for both sides. An employer can't write a contract that gives them a short 1-month notice period but forces the employee to give 6 months. It's got to be fair play. Okay, but before we jump into the standard rules for notice periods, we've got to talk about the very beginning of the contract, the trial period. This is kind of a special, more flexible phase that has its own unique set of rules. You know, the law actually has a kind of default setting for this. If your contract doesn't say a single word about a trial period, then the first month is automatically considered one. So unless your contract specifically says no trial period, you can assume you're in one for that first month. And the rules for this trial period are pretty specific. You can agree in writing to get rid of it, or you can extend it up to a maximum of 3 months. But during this time, the notice period is a super short 7 days for either person. And get this is a very important detail. If you're sick, that can actually extend the trial period. But if you take a vacation, nope, that time doesn't count. All right, so let's say you've made it through the trial period. Everything's going great. That's when the real rules, the standard notice periods, kick in. These are a lot longer, and they're tied to how long you've actually been with the company. So here's a look at the standard legal minimums. Remember, this is what applies if your contract doesn't spell out something different. In your first year of service, it's a 1-month notice. Then from your second year all the way through your 9th, it bumps up to 2 months. And once you hit that 10-year mark, it's a full 3 months. And a really key point here is how we even calculate that seniority. Where does the clock start? It starts from day 1 of the entire working relationship. So if you began your job on a fixed-term contract and then immediately moved into a permanent one with no break in between, all that time you spent on the first contract, it absolutely counts towards your years of service. Okay, deep breath. We've now reached what is probably the most critical part of this whole thing. And honestly, it's where most of the confusion happens: calculating the exact final day of your contract. See, there are basically 2 different ways to calculate your final day. The default method, the one that applies if your contract doesn't say anything else, is called for the end of a month. The other system is a net period, and this one has to be explicitly written into your contract. Let's look at how different they are. So for that first system, the end of a month one, which again is the default, it's a simple 3-step process. First, you pinpoint the date the termination letter was received. And I'm going to say this again, received. Not when it was mailed, but when it actually landed in their hands. Second, you calculate the notice period from that date. And third, you then push the actual end of the contract all the way to the last day of that same calendar month. This timeline makes it super clear. Let's walk through it. Imagine the notice letter is received on November 5th, and there's a 1-month notice period. That means the notice period technically ends on December 5th. But, and here's the catch, because of that end-of-month rule, you're actually still employed all the way to the very end of December, the 31st. Okay, now let's flip the script and look at a net period using the exact same dates. The letter is received on November 5th, the 1-month notice period ends on December 5th, and that's it. Full stop. The job ends right there on December 5th. There's no pushing it to the end of the month. You can see how huge of a difference this makes. Okay, this next part is the absolute golden rule of this entire process. Seriously, if you take away just one thing from all of this, make it this: everything, and I mean everything, depends on the date of reception. I love how the source material puts it. It says, what is decisive is not the date of notification, but that of reception. It doesn't matter when the letter was written or even when it was sent. The clock for the notice period only starts when the other person has officially received it. So you might be asking, what exactly is reception? It can be a little tricky. If a letter is handed to you in person, well, it's that day. Simple. But with registered mail, it gets interesting. If you don't pick it up, the reception date is considered the last possible day you could have picked it up from the post office. And if you're on vacation and couldn't possibly have known a letter was waiting, the reception date might actually get pushed back until you return. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground. What does this all mean for you? Let's boil it down to a quick checklist of things you need to go look for in your own contract, like right now. Seriously, go grab your contract and look for these 4 things. First, how long is your trial period? Second, what's the notice period after the trial? Third, and this is the big one we just talked about, does it specify a net calculation? Because if it doesn't say anything, you know the default is for the end of the month. And finally, does it say you have to resign in a specific way, like using a registered letter? And that really brings us to the final, all-important question you need to answer for yourself. This one tiny detail in your contract could change your final day of work by weeks. So, now that you know what you're looking for, go check. Is your contract net or is it for the end of the month?